My family held my funeral while I was alive. Then I showed up to collect my inheritance. 81-year-old Pearl Jenkins had been living in a private care facility for 6 months when she overheard the conversation that would change everything. Her daughter Monica and son Richard were standing outside her room discussing funeral arrangements for a woman who was very much alive. "Mom isn't going to last much longer," Monica said quietly. "The doctor said maybe a few weeks at most we should start making arrangement." Richard nodded solemnly. "We need to handle this carefully. The will reading should happen right after the service, before anyone starts asking questions about the estate." Pearl lay in her hospital bed, listening to her children plan her death while she was still breathing, still thinking, still very much aware of what they were doing. The doctors had told her family that her condition was terminal, but they had also told Pearl privately that while she was very ill, she could potentially live for months or even years with proper care. But her children had apparently decided that months or years was too long to wait for their inheritance. Pearl had been battling cancer for 2 years, and the treatment had taken a significant toll on her physical strength, but her mind remained sharp despite what her family seemed to believe she understood exactly what was happening and why. 6 months earlier, when Pearl's health had declined to the point where she needed full-time care, Monica and Richard had convinced her to move into Sunrise Manor, a luxury assisted living facility that cost $8,000 per month. They told Pearl it was temporary, just until she regained her strength. But Pearl soon realized that her children had no intention of bringing her home. They had already begun the process of selling her house, disposing of her belongings, and positioning themselves to inherit her substantial estate as quickly as possible. Pearl owned significant assets, including a four-bedroom house in an upscale neighborhood worth approximately $600,000 investment accounts, totaling nearly $400,000, and a collection of vintage jewelry that had been appraised at over $100,000. Her late husband Walter had been a successful insurance agent who had invested wisely throughout their 40-year marriage, and Pearl had continued managing their portfolio after his death, building their wealth through careful planning and smart financial decisions. But Monica and Richard had always lived beyond their means, constantly asking Pearl for loans to cover emergencies, pay down credit card debt, or fund lifestyle expenses they couldn't afford. They saw Pearl's illness as an opportunity to finally access the wealth they felt entitled to. What they didn't know was that Pearl had been documenting their behavior for months, recording conversations, taking notes, and gathering evidence of their growing impatience with her survival. The conversation outside her room that evening confirmed Pearl's worst suspicions. Her children weren't just waiting for her to die, they were actively planning for it. Monica continued the discussion. "We need to make sure everything is legally squared away before the funeral. I already spoke to the lawyer about expediting the will reading." Richard asked, "What did he say about the timeline?" "He said we can schedule it for the day after the service as long as we have the death certificate and all the paperwork filed correctly." Monica replied. Pearl felt a chill run down her spine. They were talking about her death like it was a business transaction, not the loss of their mother. But then Richard said something that made Pearl's blood run cold. "What about the timing issue with the facility?" "What do you mean?" Monica asked. "Well, if Mom dies here at Sunrise Manor, there will be an autopsy, potentially an investigation," Richard explained. "But if she dies at home or somewhere less monitored, it would be simpler." Monica was quiet for a moment, then said the doctor said she could go into respiratory failure at any time, especially if she skips her medications or if there are complications. Pearl realized with growing horror that her children were discussing not just planning for her death, but potentially hastening it. She listened as they continued planning, discussing which funeral home to use, what kind of service to hold, how to notify extended family members and friends. They talked about the cost of the funeral and how to pay for it using funds from Pearl's estate. They also discussed which relatives to invite and which ones to avoid, specifically mentioning that they didn't want Pearl's sister Margaret to attend, because Margaret had always been suspicious of their motives. What troubled Pearl most was how matter-of-fact their discussion was. They showed no sadness about losing their mother, no grief about her suffering, no concern for her comfort in her final days, only cold calculation about inheritance, logistic. After Monica and Richard left that evening, Pearl lay awake thinking about what she had heard and what she needed to do to protect herself. She realized that her children had probably been telling people she was already dead or close to it in order to start the inheritance process. The next morning, Pearl asked her nurse Maria to help her make some phone calls. She told Maria that she was concerned about some family matters and needed to check on a few things. First, Pearl called her lawyer, David Hoffman, who had been handling her legal affairs for over a decade. She told him about the conversation she had overheard and asked him to review her will and estate planning document. David was shocked to learn what Monica and Richard had been discussing. He told Pearl that several people had contacted his office in recent weeks, asking about the status of her will and when it would be probated. Apparently, Monica had been telling people that Pearl was already dead or dying imminently, and that the will reading was being scheduled. David had assumed these were just inquiries from concerned family members, but now he realized they were part of a larger scheme. Pearl then called her sister Margaret, who lived in another state. Margaret was surprised to hear from Pearl because Monica had told her 2 weeks earlier that Pearl had died peacefully in her sleep. Margaret said she had been devastated by the news and had sent flowers to the funeral home that Monica had specified. She had also been planning to travel to attend the service, which Monica had told her was being held privately for immediate family only. Pearl realized that Monica and Richard had been spreading news of her death while she was still alive, probably to avoid having people visit her or ask questions about her condition. Pearl asked Margaret to start making some phone calls to other family members and friends to find out what they had been told about her condition. Margaret agreed and promised to report back. Over the next few days, Margaret called Pearl with disturbing news. Multiple people had been told that Pearl was dead, including Pearl's longtime friend, Helen Pearl's former neighbor, Mrs. Chen, and even Pearl's doctor, who had been told that Pearl had died at home and would no longer need his services. Monica and Richard had apparently created an elaborate fiction about Pearl's death, complete with details about her peaceful passing, her final words, and the arrangements for a small private funeral. But perhaps most shocking was Margaret's discovery that Monica had already scheduled a funeral service for the following Friday at Hamilton Funeral Home and had invited several family members to attend. Pearl realized that her children were planning to hold an actual funeral service while she was still alive, probably as a way to make her death seem real and official before proceeding with the will reading and inheritance distribution. She decided that she needed to take immediate action to protect herself and expose what her children were doing. Pearl called David Hoffman again and asked him to meet with her at the care facility. She wanted to make some immediate changes to her will and estate planning. When David arrived the next day, Pearl explained the full scope of what she had discovered. Her children had not only spread false news of her death, but were actively planning a funeral service while she was still alive. David told Pearl that what Monica and Richard were doing was not just unethical, but potentially criminal. They could be charged with fraud, identity theft, and potentially conspiracy, depending on how far they intended to take their scheme. Pearl asked David to help her develop a plan to expose their deception and protect her assets. David suggested that they should involve law enforcement, but Pearl wanted to handle the situation in a way that would teach her children a lesson. They would never forget. Together, they developed a strategy that would allow Pearl's children to proceed with their fake funeral while she gathered evidence and prepared to reveal the truth at the most dramatic moment possible. First, David helped Pearl create a new will that completely excluded Monica and Richard from her inheritance, instead leaving everything to Margaret, her longtime friend Helen, and several charities that Pearl supported. Then Pearl arranged to secretly leave the care facility on the day of her supposed funeral with Maria the nurse's help. She would be able to attend her own funeral service and confront her children in front of all the attendees. David also arranged for a private investigator to document the funeral service and gather evidence of the fraud that Monica and Richard were perpetrating. Finally, Pearl asked David to schedule a real will reading for immediately after the funeral service, at which time she would reveal her new will and the truth about her children's deception. As the day of the funeral approached, Pearl learned more disturbing details about her children's plans. Maria overheard Monica on the phone discussing how much money they expected to inherit and how they planned to divide the assets. Monica mentioned that she wanted to keep the house while Richard would take most of the investment accounts. Richard had apparently already made arrangements to sell Pearl's vintage jewelry collection to a dealer who was expecting to take possession immediately after the funeral. Most disturbing of all, Pearl discovered that Monica and Richard had been forging her signature on various documents, including insurance paperwork and financial account changes. They had been systematically taking control of her assets while spreading the story of her death. The night before the funeral, Pearl could barely sleep. She was nervous about confronting her children, but also excited about finally exposing their greed and deception. Friday morning arrived, and Pearl prepared for what would either be the most dramatic day of her life or potentially her last day, if her children discovered her plan and decided to make their lies come true. Maria helped Pearl dress in her best black dress and pearls she wanted to look dignified for her own funeral. David arrived at the care facility early to escort Pearl to the funeral home. They drove separately from the family and arrived after the service had already begun. Pearl sat in the back of Hamilton Funeral Home, listening to Monica deliver a eulogy about what a wonderful mother Pearl had been and how much she would be missed. Monica spoke about Pearl's kindness, her generosity, her devotion to family, and her peaceful death surrounded by loved ones. Richard also spoke about his mother's legacy and how she had taught him the importance of family and financial responsibility. He mentioned how grateful he was for everything she had given him and how he planned to honor her memory. Pearl listened to her children lie about her death, lie about their relationship with her, and lie about their grief over losing her. She watched relatives and friends crying genuine tears for a woman who was sitting 20 feet away from them. The funeral director spoke about Pearl's life, her marriage to Walter, her devotion to her children, and her community involvement. He mentioned that Pearl had specifically requested a simple service and had asked that mourners remember her by being kind to their own family members. After the eulogies, Monica announced that there would be a brief reception in the funeral home lobby where people could share memories and offer condolences to the family. She also mentioned that the will reading would take place later that afternoon for family members only. As people began moving toward the lobby, Pearl stood up from her seat in the back of the room. At first, nobody noticed her because she had been sitting in shadows, and people were focused on exiting their rows. But as Pearl walked slowly down the center aisle toward the front of the room, people began to recognize her. The first person to see her was Mrs. Chen, who let out a gasp and pointed at Pearl. Others turned to look, and within seconds, the entire room was staring at Pearl in shock. Monica and Richard were standing near the casket, receiving condolences. When they heard the commotion, they turned around and saw their mother walking toward them, very much alive and very clearly upset. Monica went pale and grabbed Richard's arm. Richard stared at Pearl as if seeing a ghost, which in a way he was. Pearl walked all the way to the front of the room where the casket sat, surrounded by flowers. Then she turned to face the gathered mourners. She spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried throughout the room. "Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming to my funeral. It's not often that a person gets to attend their own service and hear what people really think about them." The room was completely silent. People were staring at Pearl in disbelief. Some were crying. Others were laughing nervously. A few people had taken out their phones to record what was happening. Pearl continued, "I especially want to thank my children, Monica and Richard, for organizing such a beautiful service and for all the kind things they said about me today. It's touching to know how much they love and miss me." Monica found her voice and stammered, "Mom, what are you doing here? You should be at the facility resting." Pearl looked at her daughter and smiled. "I should be resting, Monica. But it's hard to rest when your own children are planning your funeral while you're still alive." She turned back to the gathered mourners and explained what had been happening for the past several weeks, how Monica and Richard had been telling people she was dead, how they had planned this funeral service, and how they had been positioning themselves to inherit her estate. Pearl also revealed that she had been recording conversations and gathering evidence of their deception with the help of her lawyer and a private investigator. The room erupted in shocked conversations. People were asking each other what they had been told about Pearl's death when they had heard the news and who had informed them. Margaret stood up from her seat and announced that she had been told 2 weeks ago that Pearl had died peacefully in her sleep. Helen said she had received a phone call from Monica 3 days earlier, informing her of Pearl's death and inviting her to the funeral. Several other people confirmed that they had been contacted by Monica or Richard with news of Pearl's death and details about the funeral service. Meanwhile, Monica and Richard stood frozen near the casket, unable to explain or justify what they had done. Pearl then announced that there would indeed be a will reading that afternoon, but not the kind that Monica and Richard had been expecting. She revealed that she had created a new will that excluded both of them from her inheritance because of their greed, their deception, and their willingness to lie about her death for financial gain. The will reading took place as scheduled that afternoon, but instead of Monica and Richard inheriting Pearl's estate, they learned that they would receive nothing. Pearl's entire estate was divided between Margaret, Helen, and several charities that Pearl had supported throughout her life. Monica tried to argue that the new will was invalid, that Pearl wasn't mentally competent to make such decisions, but David Hoffman had extensive documentation proving that Pearl was sharp, alert, and fully capable of managing her own affairs. Richard attempted to claim that they had been acting in Pearl's best interests, trying to plan ahead for her inevitable death, but the evidence of their lies and deception was overwhelming. Pearl had recorded conversations where Monica and Richard discussed hastening her death. She had documentation showing that they had been forging her signature, and she had witnessed testimony from multiple people who had been told false information about her death. The private investigator presented evidence showing that Monica and Richard had been systematically taking control of Pearl's assets while spreading news of her death. They had been planning to complete the inheritance process and disappear with her money while she was still alive. Both Monica and Richard faced potential criminal charges for fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. The district attorney's office opened an investigation based on the evidence that Pearl and David had gathered. But perhaps more devastating than any legal consequences was the public humiliation of being exposed as people who had planned their mother's funeral while she was still alive in order to steal her inheritance. The story spread quickly throughout their community and beyond. Monica lost her job at a local bank. When her employer learned about the scandal, Richard was forced to resign from his position on the city council. Pearl lived for another 3 years after her fake funeral, during which time she had minimal contact with Monica and Richard. They made several attempts to reconcile and apologize, but Pearl had seen their true character and chose to spend her remaining time with people who genuinely cared about her. When Pearl did eventually pass away at age 84, her real funeral was attended by hundreds of people who remembered her, not just as a victim of family greed, but as a woman who had stood up for herself and exposed deception with courage and dignity. Margaret delivered the eulogy at Pearl's real funeral, speaking about her sister's strength, intelligence, and refusal to be victimized by her own children. She mentioned how Pearl had taught everyone that family love should never be conditional on inheritance expectation. Helen spoke about Pearl's friendship and loyalty, emphasizing how Pearl had always been generous with her time, attention, and resources, but had never tolerated being taken advantage of. The funeral director, who had unknowingly participated in Pearl's fake funeral service, spoke about how Pearl's story had changed his perspective on family dynamics and the importance of verifying information before proceeding with arrangements. Pearl's real funeral was everything. Her fake funeral had pretended to be a genuine celebration of a life well lived, attended by people who truly mourned her loss and celebrated her memory. Monica and Richard attended their mother's real funeral, but sat in the back and did not speak. They had learned too late that their greed had cost them not just their inheritance, but their relationship with their mother and their standing in the community. Pearl's story became widely known as an example of how elder abuse can take many forms and how important it is for elderly people to protect themselves from family members who see them as financial opportunities rather than loved ones. The case also highlighted the need for better safeguards in the funeral industry to prevent people from organizing services for individuals who are still alive. Pearl Jenkins proved that being elderly and ill does not mean being powerless, and that sometimes the most effective way to deal with family betrayal is to let the betrayers expose themselves through their own greed and deception. Her legacy lived on, not just through the charities and individuals who inherited her estate, but through the lessons she taught about standing up to family members who mistake kindness for weakness and mistake silence for acceptance. Pearl had spent 81 years learning that quiet doesn't mean weak, that being sick doesn't mean being stupid, and that family members who are motivated by greed will eventually reveal their true character if given enough rope to hang themselves. The fake funeral that Monica and Richard organized became a symbol of how far some people will go to acquire wealth they feel entitled to, but it also became a symbol of how courage, truth, and careful planning can triumph over deception and greed. Pearl Jenkins attended her own funeral and lived to tell about it, proving that reports of her death had been greatly exaggerated and that the only thing that had really died that day was her children's chance at inheriting anything from the mother. They had tried to bury while she was still breathing,